The Rhine had become the boundary between worlds. On one side, the collapsing German Reich, fractured, burning, bleeding into the earth. On the other, the advancing Allies, hungry, relentless, mechanical. And between them, water. 300 meters of dark churning water that had swallowed men whole, that had devoured pontoon bridges in seconds under artillery fire, that had transformed victory into postponement and delay into a luxury no general could afford. It was March 1945, and winter was dying. But nothing else was dying as quickly as hope itself. The mud, the cold, the endless hunger for forward momentum that consumed every calculation, every risk assessment, every whispered prayer in the cold tents where officers moved tokens across maps like priests reading entrails for signs of God's will. General Bernard Montgomery stood at the Rhine's edge on a gray morning, watching the water move with terrible indifference. Behind him were 1,000,000 men. Ahead was the river. Above them, German artillery waited in the hills like hungry birds. The crossing had to happen. The war's end depended on it. But the mathematics of war had become cruel. Every conventional bridge took time. Every pontoon structure offered itself as a target. Engineers died laying cables. Infantry died crossing exposed spans. And tanks, the instruments of breakthrough and momentum, remained on the wrong side of the water, impotent, waiting, their crews grinding their teeth against the cold and the futility. The solutions had all failed. Military engineers had proposed nothing but complexity. Massive pontoon systems requiring days to construct, steel bridges requiring materials that did not exist, underwater cables that would take weeks to install. The generals listened to these proposals the way men listen to prayers they no longer believe in, with respect for the effort, but without hope. Time was not a luxury the Allies possessed. Germany was collapsing, yes, but it was collapsing slowly, and every day of delay was a day the Wehrmacht might consolidate its defenses in the mountains beyond the Rhine, a day that might cost thousands of lives in the push toward Berlin, toward Czechoslovakia, toward the final reckoning. Then came the moment when someone, a farmer, they said, though no one ever wrote down his name, suggested something so absurd that it almost worked precisely because no one believed it would work. A rope, not steel, not engineering marvel or technological wonder, not some gleaming monument to human ingenuity that would be photographed for technical journals. A rope. The kind a man uses to haul cattle across a ditch. The kind that sits coiled in a barn through seasons of rain and forgetting. The kind that farmers' sons learn to tie when they are 7 years old, working alongside their fathers in the spring mud, learning the language of tension and knots and the simple mathematics of leverage. And yet this rope, this impossible thing, would become the vein through which the lifeblood of armored victory would flow. This is the story of how desperation, ingenuity, and one farmer's stupid idea changed everything. How, in the final months of the war, men learned to make tanks dance across rivers as though defying the very physics that had held them prisoner for weeks. The commanding officers listened with the skepticism of men accustomed to billion-dollar budgets and 4-year strategic plans. A farmer, a rope. In a war measured in megatons and measured in blood counted in the millions. And yet, something in the proposal stuck, not because it was grand, but because it was honest. It was born from necessity, not theory. From the ground, not the sky. From a man who had watched rivers his entire life and understood them the way only someone who has lived alongside water can understand it. Not as an obstacle, but as a living thing with patterns and moods and a language all its own. What followed was a series of meetings in that tent, where maps lay spread like sacred texts and the smell of cigarette smoke hung in air thick with exhaustion. The farmer drew pictures in the dust on the canvas floor. He used his hands. He made calculations that seemed to come from instinct rather than formula. And slowly, over hours that felt like confession, like a man finally speaking a truth he had been carrying too long, he convinced them, not through authority, not through credentials or degrees from military academies, but through clarity, through the absolute certainty that comes when someone understands a problem so thoroughly that the solution becomes visible, obvious, waiting to be acknowledged like a truth that has always existed, but was simply waiting for someone brave enough to speak it aloud. By the time the farmer left that tent, Operation Plunder would be transformed from a conventional crossing into something unprecedented, something that would later be studied in military academies not as a model of engineering, but as a model of thinking outside the prison of conventional warfare. His name survives in fragments in declassified documents. Some records call him a consultant, others simply note local civilian expertise. But what matters is not his name. It is the moment he walked into that command tent and saw the problem that had paralyzed military minds for weeks. The map showed the Rhine stretching across the landscape like a scar. The intelligence showed German positions dug into the hills beyond. The photographs showed the destroyed bridges, skeletal remains of failed crossings, monuments to the cost of desperation. The mathematics showed why tanks could not cross. Every bridge was interdicted by artillery. Every pontoon project was a coffin waiting to be filled with bodies and steel. And the generals were running out of time, running out of options, running out of the psychological capital needed to send more men into more water, with more certainty of death. The farmer saw something different. He did not see a military problem. He saw an agricultural problem. He saw farmers' problems transposed into the language of war. He saw the way a plow distributes weight across soil so that the earth beneath does not rupture, does not compress beyond repair. He saw how animals, heavy and real and pulling enormous loads, moved across earth through the distribution of force along their legs, their bodies, their entire being used as a system rather than a point. He understood tension and distribution, and the way force flows through a simple thing when that simple thing is placed correctly at the correct angle with the correct support. And in that understanding, in that moment of clarity where agricultural wisdom met military necessity, he saw the possibility. What if, he said, and history often pivots on the timidity of what ifs. What if the weight of a tank were not concentrated at a single point? What if it were not held up by a bridge but suspended? What if, instead of building a bridge for a tank to cross, you built a system for a tank to be carried across, suspended between multiple anchor points like a massive weight in a farmer's sling? It was mad. It violated every principle of military engineering taught in academies. It required trusting a rope. But it also required no steel manufacturing capacity, no time constructing complex frameworks, no exposed workers hammering rivets under fire. Just rope. Lots of rope. Strong rope. And perhaps most importantly, rope that could be strung quickly, in darkness, by men who understood leverage and physics and the way a simple mechanism could transform the impossible into the inevitable. The farmer drew it in dust on the tent floor. He used his hands to show the angle, the distribution, the flow of weight. He made calculations that seemed to come from instinct rather than formula, though later the engineers would realize his calculations were sound, grounded in observations he had made watching rivers for 50 years. He explained how cables could be strung across the river at an angle, not perpendicular, but diagonal, creating a system where a tank suspended on the cables would use gravity itself as part of the lifting mechanism. The water beneath would help support the weight. The tension in the cables would distribute the force across multiple points rather than concentrating it on a single bridge structure vulnerable to artillery fire. And slowly, over hours that felt like confession, he convinced them. Not through authority, not through credentials that had been earned in universities or military institutions, but through clarity, through the absolute certainty that comes when someone understands a problem so thoroughly that the solution becomes visible, obvious, waiting to be acknowledged like a truth that has always existed. The engineers in that tent looked at each other. Some nodded. Some made notes. One, a captain named James who would later write about this moment in letters home, actually smiled. It was not a guaranteed solution. It was not even a tested solution. But it was something. In that moment when desperation had become a commodity more valuable than hope, something was enough. The cables would need to be steel. There was no getting around that. But the cables could be thin enough to be strung quickly, thin enough to fit in supply trucks that could move under cover of darkness. The pulleys could be improvised from engineering components already available in the quartermaster's inventory. The anchor points could be dug into the riverbanks and secured with dead men, logs buried deep the way farmers had anchored fences for generations. The actual mechanism for pulling the tanks across could be powered by portable winches or even by teams of men, and captured German vehicles repurposed as pulling engines. It was a system born from constraint, from the absence of resources forcing creativity. It was a system that could work because it had to work. They called it the rope cable system. Though rope was something of a misnomer, the core was actually half-inch steel cable, salvaged from demolished German fortifications and requisitioned from supply lines that were meant to deliver ammunition but could be temporarily redirected for this purpose. The engineers refined the farmer's concept, added pulleys from tank recovery winches, added the mathematics that would make it functional rather than merely theoretical. But the core remained the farmer's insight: distribute, suspend, pull. The cables were anchored to the riverbanks, held by teams of men and machinery that would have been vulnerable, exposed, scattered across the water's edge like prey waiting for predators. But timing is everything in war, and in those final weeks the Germans were too few, too depleted, too fractured by the simultaneous pressure from the Soviets in the east and the Allies in the west to maintain the kind of coordinated firepower that might have turned those cable systems into killing fields. Preparation took 48 hours. Engineers worked through the night, stringing cables, testing tensions, running winches with empty loads to ensure the mechanics would function under stress. The soldiers who watched this preparation did not believe it would work. They had seen too many solutions fail, too many innovations become mass graves of ambition and misplaced confidence. But they helped anyway, because they had been ordered to help, and because in war, you do your duty even when you have stopped believing in its purpose. The cables went across the river in darkness, guided by men standing in the water up to their chests, their bodies going numb in the cold, their minds already reconciling themselves to the possibility of becoming casualties of this experiment. By dawn on the first day of the crossing, the system was ready. The Rhine, that river that had seemed like the barrier between victory and endless stalemate, was studded with pulleys and cable supports. On the western bank, a Sherman tank sat with its engine running. Inside the tank, a driver named Richardson, a 22-year-old from Ohio who had crossed Europe in this machine and believed it could survive anything, prepared himself for something completely new. He could not see forward over the river. The tank had been positioned to look forward into darkness and mud. He could only follow the signals of men standing on the bank, gesturing, waving him forward into the embrace of this mechanism that existed at the boundary between engineering and faith, between military theory and agricultural improvisation. The winch operator, a sergeant named Walsh, took a deep breath and engaged the motor. The cables went taut with a sound like ice cracking across a frozen lake. The weight of 60 tons began to move. The suspension cables angled downward toward the river, creating that diagonal configuration the farmer had described. And then, the most improbable moment, it worked. The tank lifted slightly off its treads, suspended for one terrible moment between the earth and the water. Richardson felt it, the sudden lightness, the disorientation of being held in the air by cables he could not see, by a system he did not fully understand. His hands gripped the controls with the ferocity of a man holding on to consciousness itself. 50 meters into the river, the cables held, 50 meters from the western bank. The water current pushed at the cables, visible only as slight vibrations that ran through the entire system like the pulse of something alive. But the cables did not break. The pulleys did not fail. 75 meters, the river's center, the deepest part. Richardson's heart was hammering in his chest, a rhythm that felt almost religious, almost like prayer. 90 meters. The far bank was visible now, getting closer with the slow grinding motion of the winches pulling him forward, pulling the tank forward, pulling this entire impossible system toward completion. 100 meters, the eastern bank. The tank's treads found purchase on solid ground. Walsh throttled down the winch, and Richardson felt the gradual settling of the tank as its weight returned to the earth, as gravity and steel reconnected in a new location. He opened the hatch. 35 men were watching him. He climbed out, his legs shaking, unable to fully process what had just happened. They had crossed the Rhine, not by bridge, not by ferry or amphibious assault, but by suspension, by cables, by a farmer's logic made metal and mathematics. By the time Richardson was standing on the eastern bank, another tank was already being positioned in the starting zone on the western bank. The system refined itself through repetition. The teams learned timing. The mechanics understood the stress points. Winch operators developed a rhythm. By the second tank crossing, the time had decreased from 90 minutes to 60. By the third, to 45. By the first week, tanks were crossing every hour. By the third week, the rate exceeded what any conventional bridge could have achieved, and the conventional pontoon bridge was being constructed elsewhere along the Rhine as backup, insurance against the impossible, failing to keep pace with the farmer's logic made manifest. But genius and circumstance are not the same thing as safety. The German resistance had not vanished. It had only become sporadic, vindictive, fired from positions that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Mortars fell without warning. Artillery spoke from coordinates the maps could not locate. And suddenly the rope system became not an innovation, but a concentration of machinery and men and movement that invited obliteration. The fourth week of March brought the heaviest bombardment since the operation began. A shell found the water near the third cable anchorage, not a direct hit, but close enough to send shrapnel into the wooden supports that held the anchored deadmen. The cable did not break, but something had changed in its structure, invisible fractures in the metal that would only become apparent under stress. The next tank to cross was heavier than the others, a Tiger tank captured and recommissioned, sent across the Rhine in the ultimate display of confidence in the farmer's system, 70 tons instead of 60. Walsh engaged the winch. The cables went taut. The tank lifted, but this time, at 75 meters into the crossing, at the deepest point in the river, the wounded cable began to sing. A sound like wind through telephone wires, like something alive and suffering. The tank swung slightly. The driver felt it, that sudden shift, that moment of uncertainty when the ground beneath you becomes liquid, and your faith in metal and mathematics is tested against the void. The cable held, barely. Walsh saw it in the slight slack that appeared in the cable, the way it was no longer perfectly taut but had acquired a small measure of movement, a small measure of give. He reduced the throttle on the winch. The tank moved more slowly, the weight distributed differently now, the stress on the other cables increasing to compensate. 10 more meters. 20. The tank's treads felt the river bottom beneath it, felt the beginning of the slope toward the eastern bank. 30 meters from safety. Walsh was sweating despite the cold. The operator beside him was praying, actually praying. A quiet rosary in Spanish that no one had asked him to recite but which seemed appropriate to the moment, to the way the world had become uncertain again, the way the confidence of the early crossings had evaporated into tension and fear and the knowledge that they were all suspended in a system that had suddenly revealed itself to be fragile. The tank reached the eastern bank. The crew climbed out, shaking, unable to speak. The cable was replaced immediately. The operation was shut down for 6 hours while engineers inspected every meter of cable, looking for fractures, listening for the telltale singing that indicated weakness. They found 3 other sections with hairline fractures. They replaced all of it. The operation resumed, but something had changed in the psychology of the crossings. The soldiers who operated the winches now understood viscerally what it meant to hold 60 or 70 tons of metal above water, understood the fragility of the mechanism, understood that every crossing was a kind of miracle held together by metal and mathematics in the margins of safety that had suddenly become very small. They continued anyway. The schedule did not allow for caution. The war was ending, and every day of delay was a day the Wehrmacht might consolidate its defenses in the mountains, a day that might cost thousands of lives in the push toward Berlin. The rope system, elegant in concept, efficient in practice, had become a gauntlet. The soldiers learned to fear the cables in a way they had never feared conventional bridges. Because bridges are visible. Bridges have the honesty of their construction. You know what holds you. But a rope can fail in ways invisible to the eye, with no warning but a sudden drop. A rush of cold water and the absolute certainty of drowning weighted down by armor and machinery. The tanks that crossed became heavier as confidence returned. The time between crossings decreased again. The operation moved from experimental to routine. That terrifying transformation where the impossible becomes ordinary, and men stop being amazed by miracles and begin expecting them. By the end of the first month of crossings, 137 tanks had used the system. One had been lost to cable failure, its crew rescued, but the tank sunk in the river, a reminder in the mud below of the cost of innovation. The Allies had their bridgehead. The tanks were flowing across the Rhine like blood through a vein, carrying infantry, carrying supplies, carrying the momentum of the war forward toward its conclusion. And the farmer, the man whose name would be forgotten but whose logic would echo through military manuals, disappeared back into the landscape of occupied Germany, his contribution noted in reports that would be filed and archived and eventually declassified, his innovation rendered obsolete by the rapid advance of conventional engineering, his moment of brilliance absorbed into the ordinary machinery of war. By May, the war was ending. Berlin had fallen. The last German positions had collapsed or surrendered. The Rhine crossings, the farmers' crossings, had become part of the larger narrative of victory, a footnote in the story of how an industrial civilization had eventually overwhelmed another industrial civilization through the application of resources and will and the slow, grinding accumulation of advantages. The rope cables were cut down. The pulleys were removed. The dead men were dug up from the riverbanks. The logs returned to the mud they had come from, the system dismantled as thoroughly as it had been assembled. The river moved on, indifferent, as rivers do, accepting the victory and the defeat with equal silence. The farmers of the Rhine Valley emerged from their hiding places in cellars and forests where they had retreated during the bombardment. They found their fields torn by artillery. They found their farms occupied by the camps of victorious armies. They found their world transformed, their lives the backdrop to other people's histories. And somewhere among them was the farmer whose rope trick had made a difference, who had looked at a military problem and seen an agricultural solution, who had quietly contributed to the end of Nazi Germany through observation and intuition and the simple wisdom of someone who had lived their entire life working with natural systems and learning to think in terms of distribution and tension and balance. His name, when historians finally tracked it down decades later, was insignificant. He had lived a normal life. He had died a normal death. He had never been photographed wearing a uniform or receiving a medal, or standing next to generals who shook his hand for posterity. He was simply a man who had seen a problem and solved it, who had spoken when he might have remained silent, who had offered his knowledge to a system much larger than himself and then retreated back into obscurity when his contribution was complete. But the echo of his thinking persisted. Military engineers studied the rope cable system. They understood it not as a temporary solution, but as an application of principles that transcended war. The principle of distributing weight, the principle of using natural systems rather than fighting them, the principle of thinking horizontally rather than vertically, the principle of seeing a problem through the lens of agriculture rather than through the machinery of conventional warfare. The tanks that had crossed the Rhine on those cables went on to drive toward Berlin. The soldiers who operated the winches went on to fight in other battles in other countries with other weapons. Some of them survived the war. Some did not. Some eventually forgot the moment they had suspended a tank above water, held it suspended between earth and river, and pulled it toward an impossible destination. But the photograph taken that day, a grainy image showing a tank suspended above the Rhine on cables, would persist in archives for decades, would be included in military histories, would be studied by engineers trying to understand how men had solved an impossible problem with simple means and stubborn creativity. The farmer lived through the occupation of Germany that followed. He returned to his fields. He replanted what had been destroyed. He watched the world rebuild itself from the ashes and rubble of the war. He never spoke much about his contribution to the crossing, never wrote about it, never sought recognition or compensation or anything except the continuation of his ordinary life. He died eventually, as all men do, and his obituary did not mention the tanks or the cables or the moment when his logic had changed the course of history. But in the archives, in the classified documents that would eventually be declassified, in the footnotes to histories of the war, his solution persisted. a monument to the truth that sometimes the greatest innovations come not from academies or laboratories or the established corridors of power, but from a farmer standing at the edge of a river, thinking about how to distribute weight, how to move the immovable, how to use the simple tools at hand to solve an apparently impossible problem. The Rhine flows on still, carving its path through the landscape of Europe, carrying its waters toward the sea. The cables are gone. The pulleys are gone. The system has been dismantled and forgotten and remembered again in cycles. But somewhere in the river's memory, in the stories told by soldiers who crossed on those cables, in the equations studied by engineers who came after, the farmer's wisdom persists. The understanding that sometimes the most elegant solution is the simplest one, that sometimes genius looks like a man drawing pictures in dust on a canvas floor, that sometimes the weight of the world can be suspended on nothing more than rope and observation, and the absolute conviction that what seems stupid might actually be brilliant, simply because it works.